If you've just joined us, we're in conversation with Christy Viljoen, a PwC economist, as well as Neil Coleman from the Institute for Economic Justice, who are both in Cape Town. Now, Neil Coleman, tell us where in the world have the arguments you have just advanced been successful?
Well, a fantastic case study is the case of Greece and Portugal. You remember after the global economic crisis, there was a crisis in Europe, particularly Southern Europe, around debt, and the IMF moved in. There were very harsh austerity packages that were imposed in Greece and in Portugal. And in Portugal, a progressive government came in. I think it was in about 2015, and they dumped the austerity package, and they moved towards a much more stimulatory policy of investment and growth. And so you have had a situation where you had a very high debt level in Portugal and a very high debt level in Greece. What the Portuguese have managed to do is through growing, is bring their deficits down, bring their debt down, although their debt is still pretty high. But the Greek economy was absolutely decimated, lost 25% of GDP, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the Greek debt today is the second highest in the world. It's nearly 200%. So this is a classic example of where austerity on the one hand in Greece has been a disaster, and a much more stimulatory policy by the Portuguese government has been very successful, and Portugal now is one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, has halved unemployment, and is being held up as a model, in fact, within Europe. So there are, concrete examples. No one's saying that any one country constitutes a mechanical or perfect model that we can simply impose in the South African context. But the IMF studies look at dozens of different countries and conclude that austerity and the cutting back of public spending has a very, very negative impact on GDP and a much greater negative multiplier, what the economists call a multiplier, a much greater negative multiplier than they had previously thought. So something like 1% of cuts leads to close to 2% a loss in GDP. So that relationship has been fairly clearly established now.
Christy, do you agree that with that sentiment that global experience is that fiscal consolidation has not necessarily led to lower debt to GDP ratios?
Well, the simplest way of us looking at this is just thinking about how GDP is calculated. Government spending, consumption, investment, and then obviously trade. So as soon as you cut back on government spending, you're actually reducing GDP automatically by that, and then that ratio increases. So if it's maybe a ratio for budget balance or government debt, you're immediately making a negative impact on government debt in that sense. So from a theoretical perspective, yes, it does make a lot of sense. Practical examples, and Neil has given us a few good ones. He's quite correct, and the IMF research is increasingly finding that austerity is not necessarily the right way to go. If I think of the South African context at the moment, where we obviously have to come back to given this topic of the budget today, I think it's important for us to realize that we've been busy with fiscal stimulus for quite some time. And that has obviously increased our debt. The effectiveness of the fiscal stimulus has been the problem. It brings us back to the earlier point of we need to invest productively, and we need to be able to reduce spending on unproductive measures, let's put it that way, towards infrastructure, for example, towards roads, towards schools and hospitals, that kind of thing. So for me, the tricky part is finding that balance. Within the local political context, we know that labor unions have quite a strong hold over government due to the historical relationship there. So it's certainly not an easy answer. Neil admitted that you can't obviously have one single template for all countries. But I think at this stage, I would agree with him. it could be a good thing for different people to get around the table and discuss these options. It might be a way of us, in speaking to the Finance Minister, seeing what his thinking is on, I don't want to say a more personal level, but looking beyond the numbers, looking beyond the budget. We know that he's got the President's support in many of the fiscal endeavours, but we also know that within the government, within the ruling party, there are different philosophies on where the economy should be going. So I think we are maybe at this stage in some kind of a, let's call it a transition period, where ideas and philosophies maybe need to be brought a little bit closer together. Maybe we can learn a bit more from each other in finding the best way of implementing this in the South African context.
Neil Coleman, Christie says unions have a hold on the government, but I'm going back to what the minister had to say today about the public wage bill, that they have to have some tough talks with unions about how to contain this.
Yeah. So, Vuyo, in the Job Summit last year, the unions commissioned us to do research on a range of different issues relating to the Job Summit. And we produced a proposal on the question of restructuring the public sector wage bill. And when you decompose it, and the Minister actually alluded to this today, there's a lot of the fat which is being taken up in terms of that wage bill by the upper level, the upper echelons of the bureaucracy. So there's a huge amount of wastage. There's a need for a reconfiguration of the wage structure and the public service employment structure to shift resources much more to frontline service delivery. I mean, if you look at any sector, whether it's health or education, the public prosecution agencies, the police, etc., there are many, many shortages of frontline service personnel. So it's a mistake to counterpose the question of investing in society and in infrastructure to investing in the people who have to run that infrastructure and make it operational. The issue is that there's been a huge amount of wastage in terms of contracting out the functions of the higher echelons of the public service to the private sector. We've seen what has happened with state capture, both with state-owned enterprises and the public service. So we need to decompose the issue. We can't look at it as one big package. We need to look at it in a much more disaggregated way and say, how can the public service be restructured in a way which is much more efficient and effective?
Christy, do you think that the measures that the minister announced today to try and cut the fat, as Neil Coleman put it, will go a significant way in getting him the 150 billion rands that he says is needed in the next 3 years?
Well, he made some announcements about the freezing of cabinet salaries, caps on the value of official vehicles, domestic air travel, economy class, no longer business class, those things. So that'll obviously go some way towards saving some money, but that is at the very, very upper level of the government. It's going to cover a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people. So the savings are going to be limited, to be very honest. I think the Finance Minister has his eyes set on reducing the size of the overall public sector wage bill significantly. Now, as Neil said, it's a complex issue. It's something that really needs strong attention. I think the Finance Minister would like to see at least a slowdown in the growth of the wage bill. But as I alluded to earlier, the big challenge for him is just working with the labour unions. We saw with, for example, Eskom, which is also as based on international research, heavily overstaffed. Reducing the number of people at Eskom is just almost impossible given the demands of the labour unions. And it's going to be very similar when you consider more than 1 million people working for the public sector. I think the one good point that Neil has made is that it's very complex. And we are now at a situation with our economy and fiscal finances where a lot of people will be at the wrong end of tough decisions. A lot of people will feel short-term pain where the economy is maybe the long-term benefactor. And that means that we need to think about these things more clearly. We need to look a bit wider. We need to look at more different perspectives, because the challenge for us is, if we can't get this situation sorted out quickly, our economy is going to be under pressure for many, many more years. And that means unemployment rate is going to go up even further. We won't be able to address the inequality we're sitting with, which affects all kinds of issues like education, health, crime. We've got the risk that we can be stuck in this rut for quite some time. And you can't really catch up what you've lost in terms of jobs and growth. We're going to get further and further behind other emerging markets. And when the international community looks in and looks at these problems, they might decide that we are not a good investment opportunity, for example. And that then has further knock-on effects. So the fact is, the situation is very, very complex at this stage. We may be even not touching the real depth of what we need to figure out here.
Christopher Viljoen, Neil Coleman, thanks to both of you for being so generous with your time this evening. Nightline continues with your weather updates. That's when we return in a moment.